The party has for long been known for its pragmatism and for its ability to manage change well. And I think there were some hiccups along that route, including, of course, in 1989 with the riots and disorder in Tiananmen Square. But for the most part, the party has done a pretty good job. I think most people would say that. But things have changed because with Xi Jinping coming to power, there's been a new emphasis, as I said before, on authoritarianism, on control, on ideology, on the application of Marxism to public policy or aspects of public policy, repression. The party has to control everything. It is a sort, I mean, one of the people that I know, a professor at Oxford, has talked about China being he talked about it as a controlocracy. So it's a place that basically thrives on the control of the leadership and the party, a sort of dictatorship that lacks institutions of constraint and consensus, and that has roots that resonate with 50 or 60 years ago, in the sense that the system embeds barriers to dissent, to civil society, to foreign argument and foreign ideas. And this is all, you might think that this is all fine so long as everything goes well. Why would China need to be integrated or engage forcefully with the rest of the world? But of course, you can't rely on the fact that people will go through their political lives without making mistakes, and sometimes egregious mistakes. So if something goes wrong, then of course the blame falls fairly and squarely at one person's footsteps, which would be the president himself. And there is some evidence that his style of governance and government has already kind of resulted in the emergence of, I wouldn't call it dissent, that I think would be a strong word, but disquiet. So it's kind of interesting that for 4 years or 5 years, there was almost nothing. And there was this kind of belief, really, that Xi Jinping was in total control. He was, authoritarian leader. You may remember that last spring in April or March, the National People's Congress, the party basically abandoned the term limits on the president. So up until Deng Xiaoping introduced this system whereby there would be orderly succession so that presidents would not stay in power, or the leadership would not stay in power for more than 10 years. But last year, term limits on the presidency were lifted, so potentially, if he wants to, and if the party remains kind of happy with him, he could be president for life. Who knows? I mean, he's young enough to stay in power probably for another 20 or 30 years if his health held and if his enemies stayed low. So this has not always gone down well with people in China. I mean, it's not like we can't really gauge and we can't really measure public opinion in China, as you know. But there have been, so the modern version of criminologists are sinologists who basically look at the body language and the actions and the, if somebody stands up when Xi Jinping is talking, or if they don't stand up, and if they applaud or if they don't applaud. So people kind of put together sort of anecdotal information like this, and they have detected that there are certainly senior members of the party leadership that are not always completely happy with Xi Jinping's speeches when he makes them. But more poignantly, I think, is the emergence of essays and largely essays, I would say, but sometimes also comments on the Chinese internet, which are usually there long enough for somebody to take down and translate. They don't tend to stay there for very long. From eminent intellectuals at some of the China's leading universities, that basically criticize, not Xi Jinping himself, which would be, I think, probably a bridge too far, but they criticize China for going in the wrong direction. So, for example, one professor has said that it's a mistake for us to think, us being China, to think that our success is due to the exceptionalism of the party, the state, and industrial policy. Our success is down to our ability to use and apply what they call marketization, which is the application of market mechanisms within their system, to entrepreneurship and to learning from the rest of the world. Now, this is a very different kind of narrative from the one that obviously you would get from Beijing. Another professor, more recently at the end of last year, published a paper in which he stirred up what was already quite a lively debate in China. I mean, we talk about trade a lot in the West, as you know, which the Chinese do as well in the media, but actually one of the burning issues of debate in China is the role of the private sector. I mentioned before already that the private sector had been the most dynamic and explosive part of China's economic eruption. But there have been voices expressed from the party that the private sector has, quote, fulfilled its historic mission in bringing China's emergence about, or words to that effect. And criticisms that the private sector now needs to be put in its place, and that pride of place needs to be reassigned to the state sector and to the important function which China's technology companies, private or public, will play in advancing China's prosperity. So this has had the effect of actually disincentivizing a lot of private, genuinely private companies and entrepreneurs. And this particular professor has said that even though we have the capacity and we have the tools to, we can use interest rates, we can use credit policy, we can use tax cuts, we can do all sorts of things to try to stabilize, bad economic moments. But actually what we really need to do to secure our future and to ensure that we turn around from this direction in which we're heading are things which, of course, the government will not do. So he thinks they need to have total reform of the tax structure. He thinks there needs to be reform of state governance, which is kind of what we're talking about here this evening, and also political reform, which would include not just a reform of the relationship of the party to of central government to local government and the party's role within the country, but also aspects of private-public realignment, including transfer of wealth from the state sector to the private sector. These things are not going to happen under Xi Jinping. So I think it's interesting. It's true, of course, to say that these people do not run China. They are just just intellectuals and academics and people that have points of view. So we shouldn't necessarily expect there's going to be any major changes in China as a consequence of this. But it is interesting that this has emerged for the first time in Xi Jinping's China.